Hey everybody, it's me, Root Beer, and it's time for content. And today, I'm asking you, what are some of Vanguard's forgotten archetypes? So, throughout the history of the game, we've had a large variety of different iconic cards, and they'll have like a brief window of relevance before Bushiroad just stops loving them. So, my example for this is Dragon. So he was the first Strider for Shadow Paladin. He was the antagonist card for the first season of G, being Kanzaki. And after Kanzaki was defeated, he just sort of disappeared. Like, Shadow Paladin kind of just went in, like, all sorts of weird different directions, so first they had the Ren Legend deck and, like, the Diablo cards, and then afterwards they got Luard, and then, Luard kind of became the focus after that. Claret Sword did get a second form in the form of Revolt, and to be quite frank, Revolt does a lot better than, like, some of the other entries on this list, but still never quite got to the same level of relevance that he had in early G. And of course, Aura Geyser never got a V-Train, unlike other strides like Gilderai or Lambros, which is just kind of annoying, cause look at him, he's so cool! But let's see what you all have to say. Okay, so first up, Jonathan submits the Link Joker support from Legion. So their tweet also mentions Blaster Joker, but the images posted focus on Dark Zodiac, who, I will admit, is a very cool looking card, and it does have an interesting ability. It has the ability to Omega Lock your opponent's cards, which is a strong utility to have for Link Joker, being able to, like, more permanently floodgate your opponents. And while I'm not super familiar with Season 4 because I didn't really watch it, it also does appear to have a place in the opening, so I have to assume it's at least somewhat prominent. So you'd think at some point they'd give it some kind of stride support or something. I quickly checked just to make sure. I don't believe any of the Star Vader strides outside of, like, Glendios can Omega Lock. There might be a more, like, general piece of Link Joker support that can Omega Lock, but I'm not about to go looking through all of that just to, like, figure it out. I know that Flagiolet Messiah can do it, it's just weird that, like, Star Vaders can't do it in Archetype with, like, an archetypal name. Seems like a place where Dark Zodiac could come back. As for Blaster Joker, uh, I'll admit that one's a little harder to make support for just because his ability very specifically is designed to counter the Legion mechanic, right? And afterwards, we got the leaders, which more generally disrupts the Vanguard, so it's hard to imagine how Blaster Joker could look in like a new piece of support without kind of crossing over with the way the leaders work. Another Legion answer, Seekers. So, yeah, the deck never got that much in V series because it came out in like the Clan Collection era after V kind of officially ended and they started swapping over to D series. And also, like, in G itself, it got a little bit of support, but then Royal Paladin just kind of moved on into, like, more general blaster stuff as far as, like, Aichi cards go. I know, like, in the anime, Kai was the one originally playing Seekers, but in the movie, like, Aichi did move back into Seekers. I think they're just kind of a victim of like the weird arc that Aichi's cards took. So like he started with Royal Paladin originally, then Royal Paladin got sealed away and he switched over to Gold Paladin. But then after bringing Royal Paladin back, he never went back to playing Royals, he just kept on playing Golds, even though like Ren immediately went back to Shadow Paladin with Revengers. But like the Liberators just kind of kept on in Gold Paladin, and all of the old iconic cards like Alfred, Gancelot, Blaster Blade, they all just became Gold Paladin cards. And then suddenly afterwards, it's like, oh, Royal Paladin is the Aichi clan again. Alright, so you've been noticing a trend with some of the answers, but Atlas does just spell it out that, like, Legion in general kind of feels like the red-headed stepchild of Vanguard. Like, it was the most short-lived era, only had, like, two main boosters and like a couple side boosters. They didn't even give every clan Legion support originally. Like a lot of them ended up as promos or were printed after the fact in G era. And so yes, like Shadow Paladin witches were an interesting thing where like turning your opponents into like grade zeros is very disruptive and especially in G era became a very powerful piece of like floodgating because it stops you from using G guards. And at the time you couldn't guard with like higher grades than your vanguard, so it also cut you off like perfect guards. Nowadays with the rule changes, I believe you can guard with whatever grade you want, though you still need to call the same grade as your vanguard. So the idea of like turning your opponent into a grade 0 doesn't work as much anymore, but it would have still been interesting to see. Boy, we couldn't have picked a more lower resolution image, huh? But Mythgards. I'm not actually super familiar with this, so it looks like it's a rare card, and it's from like earlier in like the Limit Break era. So I started mid G, and so I'm not too familiar with these like random one-off rares, but it looks like it does care about like Mythgard card names. It has the ability to soul charge different Mythgards, and then you can soul blast to like stand all of your Mythgards. And I'm always down for more cool mech archetypes. Okay, this is one of those answers that's like literally incorrect, but spiritually is true. So like what he means here is that when Gradora came out, Darkface kind of became like second fiddle. So it was the original Strider for Mega Colony before Gradora released, and then afterwards, Darkface himself kind of got relegated to being like a support card. Also, Gradora has the Darkface name, but that's kind of besides the point. But yeah, like Darkface did get a new form alongside Gradora, but it didn't have a stride ability. Like it still had something on the Vanguard circle, but it's not really something you would want to do over having a more powerful stride ability like Gradora's. And, same thing in V, where like V Darkface can make the cradle markers, but Gradora does it better, and so you're probably better off just trying to use Darkface as a piece of support for Gradora instead. So, not literally true in that they do keep printing Darkface. They clearly haven't forgotten about him, but he is kind of playing second fiddle now. Brawlers. Another Legion answer. This is going to be a trend with this one. But yeah, they got like a handful of cards in G era, They got like a stride and then they just kind of forgot about it afterwards. Like Vanquisher got a decent amount of cards because one of the side characters in the anime played it, and then, like, they gave Eradicators some legacy support with, like, Gauntlet Buster got a stride and Descendant got a stride later, although neither of those were great, to be perfectly honest. Lyrics underscore mad says Chrono Fang, so yeah, you know, Gear Chronicle in G always kind of centered around Chrono Jet. Obviously, it was the main character card. But Chrono Fang as like a rival card for Chrono Jet was very interesting. Jet always focused more on the time leaping, so you would like jump up a grade by binding your cards, and then afterwards they would rewind back, where Chrono Fang was more about permanently binding your cards to gain like power boosts and the like. So, where Jet focused more on extra attacks, Chrono Fang had more utility, like it focused more on returning cards to the deck, which Jet used to do, but kind of stopped doing after you got the time leap stuff. And then he would focus more on gaining like criticals and drives instead of restanding the way like Next Stage did. It was an interesting thing, and I did want more Chrono Fang cards. Like I always thought it was cool, and I will admit I'm a bit of a Chrono Jet hater. I really did not like it at the time because it was like a top meta deck, but also because Chrono was the main character. Jet always got more support than everything else, so that definitely bred some level of resentment for me. Okay, so this post mentions a few different archetypes. So Demon World Castle was kind of covered in the previous one. So they did have like an archetypal card. It cared about like the Demon World Castle name, similar to the Mythgards earlier. It was like a low rarity boss unit that was kind of its own archetype, and then they just never followed up on it. They also mentioned like cosmic heroes. Cosmic heroes have always felt like they were second place to like D Robos, especially once we got to like the V boot. Like V Gallop exists, but it doesn't really play the same way. Story of my life for V. And like in general, it feels like one of the more forgotten Striders. Like I don't think Dimension Police cares all that much about playing like cosmic hero cards, even with History Collection. Hey, that's not true, Changu. They also forget about archetypes inside of Eradicator. When was the last time anyone thought about Gauntlet Buster? In fact, remember that time when they printed V Descendant, and then because Gauntlet Buster was a VR, they didn't want to reprint it, so instead they just made like a Chinese knockoff version of Gauntlet Buster instead? Ah, man. This is just making me sad. I liked Loris a lot. I really liked playing like mid G era Harmony alongside Prison. Those were some of my like favorite decks from the time. I still miss Spica. I honestly like don't know what the deal is. I think last time I asked about it, someone had mentioned something about like price, so I have to assume some sort of dispute with the artist that they clearly never resolved because in History Collection, Loris was like the one card that did not get new art. They just gave it mermaid text. Makes me sad. Sanctuary of Light. So this is an interesting one where they introduced a ride chain like late into Limit Break era, long after this design of card kind of stopped existing. And then, like, randomly in GBT 8, they gave it like a named trigger, but not a whole lot else. Alright. So, one that I missed from the last thread of cards that should have been a real archetype, Blue Wings. Like, they're so close to being a real archetype, you know? Like, they all mention Blue Wings, they have, like, a cohesive design of, like, restanding when you check a heal, they all care about the number of Blue Wings that you have, and then they just, like, never followed up on it with like a grade 3 to tie the whole thing together. You know, like the closest thing we have is the grade 2 that can restand itself, but like that's not like a real deck. That one sucks. It's another like cool aesthetic, like interesting idea, so close to being a real deck and then just never was. Blade Wings. So yeah, that's an interesting one. Blade Wings got a little bit of support in G era with like Wings of Recurrence, and it also had the other one that could like give your units shield and then you Soul Blast 2. But they never really did all too much with it afterwards. Like they kind of focused more on Amon, which I'm personally okay with because I like Amon, and then of course like the Darkness cards and the V version of Reiji where you have to like bind cards from your soul, I think. Yeah, and then like the V version of Reiji was just like a completely different playstyle where it wants to like bind cards from your soul and then gain power based on all of your like bound cards. Like that one was weird. Death Army, that's a very interesting one. So like the joke in the anime was that like Nagisa was always following Kamui around, had a huge crush on him. And so she had her own like unique Nova Grappler archetype originally in the form of like Cosmo Lord. So he like sort of does what the V versions of Beast Deities kind of ended up doing, where he like rested cards and actually, no, I think this is more like V era Aqua Force, where he would like rest cards in the main phase to get abilities, then you could like restand everything afterwards, and he could like get power and criticals from that. Very similar to like V Thavos with Lambros, but like they just never followed up on it, you know? I think Cosmo Lord still just kind of exists in that it was an old iconic card they could retrain in V, but never kind of got the focus to become a real archetype, which sucks. Like, I think Nagisa was fun, and I would like to see her get, like, her cool Death Army cards instead of just vaguely copying what Kamui does all the time. Star Hulks. So, yeah, this was, like, the final boss for the like Aichi sections of V, and he was also the villain in the like original manga. So like anime Link Joker kind of diverged from where the manga went. I think the leaders were introduced a lot sooner, as we saw in V era, and then we never got stuff like Glendios. So instead, they focused more on Brant, whose gimmick was reversing the effects of triggers. And so it's like, okay, they made Brant, and then they made like the other Brant, which I think was a grade 4, and then just kind of disappeared. They didn't even bother printing new like Star Hulk rear guards to go along with it. I think this is just a consequence of being like a one-off villain card that they never truly had any plans for, so they just kind of forgot about it afterwards, which kind of fits in with what happened to Aura Geyser too, now that I think about it. Blaster Dark Diablo. So I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about like the pattern of support with like Shadow Paladin, where we started with Aura Geyser, then we got like all of the Diablo cards. So they all cared about. So it was like the Ren Legend deck. They were retrains of all his old iconic units. So like Blaster Dark, Phantom Blaster, Spectral Duke became like a blaster card in Shadow Paladin instead of being Gold Paladin. And then like they gave it one wave of support in GBT06, which is where we got Spectral Duke or Spectral Blaster. Let's just record that again. Blaster Dark Diablo. So I talked about it earlier when I talked about Claret Sword, where they had this weird pattern of support for Shadow Paladin until Luard came out, where they like forgot about Claret Sword because he stopped being relevant in the anime. Then they released the Ren Legend deck with Diablo, and it seems like okay, that's going to be like the retrains for all of his old iconic cards, like Phantom Blaster, and then GBT6 introduced Spectral Blaster, which is a retrain of Spectral Duke, and then they just never did anything with it afterwards. They like shifted over to Revengers instead, which is sad. I thought the Diablo cards were really cool. You know, Spectral Duke was like a restanding Vanguard. Phantom Blaster Diablo was an interesting form of guard restrict where if your opponent didn't have any rear guards, they couldn't guard from the hand, which was kind of broken until G guards came out and kind of nerfed it. So I would like to see more Diablo cards, but I'll admit they probably just ran out of Ren units that weren't Revengers. Okay, so they're talking about Amon's followers, but honestly, Amon himself was the answer for a long time. This one I know was a dispute with the artist, that where Amon didn't get support for a really long time. Made it very funny how they just kept releasing cards as like Amon's leader, Amon's baron, Amon's second cousin twice removed. And then there was that time in like Phantasmal Steed Restoration where they introduced like Mordred and Lukier, and clearly there was a spot in Dark Irregulars that was supposed to be Amon, but I think they weren't working with the artist still, so instead we had Amon at home in the form of Brufos. And funny enough, Brufos then becomes an answer for this thread because they never followed up on Brufus either. Man, going through this thread really does just make me disappointed in the way Bushiroad's been handling premium support. There are all sorts of really interesting forgotten cards that could use a second chance at life as like new strides or getting new V versions, just something, you know? It also made me realize that Bushiroad just really hates Legion, don't they? Like, it really feels like they're the pendulums of Vanguard. But that's gonna be it for this video. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye!